794 AD, Heian Kyo. To understand the soul of Japan, one must first understand the dream of Heian Kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. Long before the thunder of galloping horses or the flash of steel defined the Japanese landscape, there was the scent of incense, the rustle of silk, and the delicate cadence of poetry. This was the Heian period, an era where the world was not measured by territory conquered, but by the elegance of a brushstroke and the subtlety of a seasonal illusion. At the heart of this world sat the imperial court. Here, the aristocracy, the huge asterisk, lived in a gilded cocoon, insulated from the harsh realities of the provinces. For these nobles, life was a meticulously choreographed performance. To exist was to participate in an endless cycle of ritual, ceremony, and aesthetic pursuit. Status was not merely determined by bloodline, but by one's ability to master the rule of taste. A misplaced word in a poem, a garment of clashing colors, or an inability to recognize the melancholy beauty of a falling cherry blossom could result in social ruin. This was an era of profound psychological depth. It was during these centuries that the concept of asterisk mono no aware asterisk, the pathos of things, was born. It is a uniquely Japanese sensibility, a bittersweet awareness of the transience of all things. The beauty of the moon was heightened by the knowledge that clouds would soon obscure it. The glory of the blossoms was deepened by the certainty of their fall. This obsession with the fleeting nature of beauty found its most enduring expression in the literature of the time. Through the eyes of noblewomen like Murasaki Shikibu, whose masterpiece The Tale of Genji remains a pinnacle of world literature, we glimpse a world of overwhelming sensory detail and complex emotional landscapes. These women, often sequestered behind silk screens, became the true architects of Japanese aesthetics, weaving together threads of romance, jealousy, and spiritual longing. But beneath this veneer of exquisite refinement, a slow, rhythmic decay was taking hold. The Heian court was a victim of its own sophistication. As the nobility retreated further into their rituals and their pursuit of aesthetic perfection, they became increasingly detached from the mechanics of governance. The central government, once capable of taxing and managing the land, began to fracture. To fund their lavish lifestyles and maintain their complex ceremonies, the aristocracy relied on the asterisk shun system, private, tax-exempt estates owned by nobles and powerful temples. As more land became tied up in these tax-free enclaves, the imperial treasury withered. The central authority lost its grip on the provinces, unable to maintain order or provide protection against bandits and local uprisings. In this power vacuum, a new class was forced to emerge from the shadows. In the rugged countryside, distant from the incense-filled halls of Heian Kyo, families of provincial warriors began to organize. They were men of action, not of poetry, men of the sword, not of the brush. The elegance of the Heian court was a beautiful mask, masking a structural rot. The very refinement that defined the era was sowing the seeds of its destruction. The era of the courtier was drawing to a close, and the era of the warrior was about to begin. The silence of the poetry reading was about to be broken by the roar of war. Mid-12th century, the Japanese provinces. As the central authority of the imperial court continued to dissolve into a landscape of tax-exempt estates and political stagnation, the vacuum of power was filled by a force the aristocrats had long ignored: the provincial warrior. These were not the polished courtiers of the capital, but men forged in the rugged terrain of the countryside, whose authority was measured in land, loyalty, and the sharpness of their blades. From this chaos, two great lineages emerged, destined to collide in a struggle that would rewrite the destiny of Japan: the Taira and the Minamoto. To understand this rivalry, one must understand the nature of these clans. Both were descendants of the imperial line, branched off into military service centuries prior, yet they represented two entirely different paths to power. The Taira, or Hike, represented the successful infiltration of the warrior class into the very heart of the aristocracy. Through strategic marriages and calculated political maneuvering, the Taira had managed to breach the gilded walls of the capital. They were no longer merely provincial warriors. They had become courtiers in all but name. Led by the formidable Taira no Kiyomori, the clan achieved something unprecedented. They seized the levers of the imperial government itself. Kiyomori's rise was meteoric. He manipulated the succession of emperors, controlled the distribution of land, and effectively turned the imperial throne into a tool of Taira interests. Under the Taira, the warrior had become the new aristocrat, blending the brutal efficiency of the soldier with the sophisticated politics of the court. But as the Taira ascended, they became victims of their own success. By embedding themselves in the delicate social fabric of the capital, they became disconnected from the rugged, martial roots that gave them strength. They were seen by many as usurpers, warriors who had traded their honor for silk robes and political intrigue. Opposing this sudden hegemony were the Minamoto, or Genji. Unlike the Taira, the Minamoto had been pushed to the periphery. Having been sidelined by the rising influence of the Taira, the Minamoto branches retreated to the distant provinces, far from the incense-scented halls of Haikaiyo. In the wilderness, they did not indulge in poetry or courtly ritual. Instead, they honed the art of war. They built deep-rooted networks of vassalage, cultivating a fierce, unbreakable bond of loyalty between lord and man. The Minamoto became the embodiment of the pure warrior spirit, disciplined, decentralized, and profoundly dangerous. The tension between these two clans was not merely a personal feud between families. It was a structural conflict between two different visions of Japan. On one side stood the Taira, a centralized, court-aligned power seeking to rule through the existing imperial machinery. On the other stood the Minamoto, a decentralized, provincial force representing the raw, unyielding power of the landed military class. As the Taira grew more dominant, their overreach created a pressure cooker of resentment. The provincial lords, the monks of the great temples, and the disenfranchised Minamoto branches all watched as the Taira tightened their grip. The stage was set. The elegance of the Heian era was not just fading, it was being torn asunder. The shadow of the sword was lengthening, and the collision between the refined Taira and the primal Minamoto was becoming inevitable. The era of political maneuvering was ending. The era of total war had arrived. 1180, the imperial capital of Heian. The tension that had been simmering for decades finally boiled over into open rebellion. The spark was not a single event, but a desperate gamble by the exiled Minamoto clan. Seeking to reclaim their lost prestige, they rose up against the Taira hegemony, igniting a conflagration that would consume the nation for 4 years. This was the Genpei War, not merely a civil war between two families, but a cataclysmic struggle that would decide whether Japan would be ruled by the refined politics of the court or the brutal reality of the sword. The early years of the conflict were characterized by shifting tides and tactical brilliance. The Taira, despite their political dominance, initially held the advantage in numbers and resources. They fought with the confidence of a clan that had integrated itself into the very machinery of the state. But they were fighting a ghost. The Minamoto, led by the brilliant and ruthless Minamoto no Yoritomo, operated from the shadows of the provinces. While Yoritomo built a political foundation of unbreakable vassalage in the east, his brothers, Yoshitomo and the legendary Yoshitsune, took to the battlefield to strike at the heart of Terra power. The war moved with terrifying speed across the Japanese archipelago. It was a conflict of high drama and profound tragedy, where the traditional rules of engagement were often discarded in favor of total annihilation. We see this most clearly in the pivotal battles of Ikaino-Tani and Yashima, where the Minamoto utilized daring maneuvers, including unconventional cavalry charges and mountain descents, to shatter the Terra lines. However, the true climax of the Genpei War lay not on the plains but upon the waves. The conflict reached its bloody crescendo at the Battle of Dan no Yura in 1185. In the treacherous currents of the Shimonoseki Strait, the two greatest warrior clans in Japanese history met for one final, decisive engagement. It was a maritime slaughter. The Minamoto, utilizing superior naval tactics, hemmed in the Terra fleet. As the tide turned, the once mighty Terra clan faced total extinction. The tragedy of Dan no Yura remains one of the most haunting images in Japanese history. As the Terra realized defeat was inevitable, the women and children of the clan were cast into the sea, and the young child emperor, Antoku, was taken into the depths by his grandmother to prevent his capture. In a single afternoon, the Terra lineage, and the era of their courtly dominance, was swallowed by the ocean. The aftermath of Dan no Yura was a silence that fell over the old world. The imperial court, once the undisputed center of the universe, found itself stripped of its ability to command the military. The warriors had realized a terrifying truth. The emperor could grant legitimacy, but only the sword could grant power. The Genpei War did more than just replace one clan with another. It fundamentally altered the DNA of Japanese governance. The era of the Heian aristocrat, defined by poetry and incense, was dead. In its place, a new, colder reality emerged. The vacuum left by the fallen Terra did not lead back to imperial rule, but rather to a new kind of authority, a military government that would rule from the shadows of the provinces for centuries to come. The age of the shogun had begun. 1185 Kamakura. The dust of the Dan no Yura battlefield had barely settled, and the echoes of the Terra clan's final, tragic cries had faded into the sea. But while the warriors in the field celebrated a hard-won victory, the true architect of the new Japan was not standing amidst the blood and wreckage of the coast. He was hundreds of miles away, in the rugged, eastern provinces, meticulously weaving a web of power that would change the course of history forever. This man was Minamoto no Yoritomo. Unlike his brothers, Yoshitomo and the legendary Yoshitsune, Yoritomo was not a man of the frontline charge or the poetic battlefield maneuver. While his kin were carving their names into the annals of martial glory, Yoritomo was engaged in a far more complex form of warfare, the war of administration, loyalty, and legal legitimacy. He understood a fundamental truth that his brothers did not, that winning a war is an act of violence, but winning a peace requires the architecture of authority. Yoritomo retreated to Kamakura, a coastal settlement far from the decadent, suffocating influence of the imperial court in Heian-Kaiō. He chose this location with surgical precision. Kamakura was a stronghold of the Eastern warrior class, a place where the air was thick with the scent of salt and the grit of provincial life. far removed from the silken intrigues of the aristocrats. By establishing his base here, Yoritomo was making a declaration. The era of the courtier was over. The era of the provincial warrior had arrived. His goal was not to destroy the emperor, but to bypass him. He did not seek to sit on the chrysanthemum throne, for he knew that the throne's power was symbolic, rooted in ancient divinity. Instead, he sought a title that would allow him to command the military without the burden of imperial ritual. He sought to become the *sei Taishogun *, the barbarian subduing generalissimo. Through a series of shrewd political maneuvers, Yoritomo secured this title, but his true genius lay in the creation of the *bakufu*, or the tent government. This was not a mere court in exile. It was a revolutionary military administration. At the heart of this new system was the concept of direct vassalage. Yoritomo bypassed the complex, layered bureaucracy of the old imperial system and established a direct, personal bond between himself and the local landholders, the Goknin *. In exchange for their absolute loyalty and military service, Yoritomo guaranteed their rights to the lands they held. He became the ultimate arbiter of justice and property. If a warrior had a claim to a field or a forest, he no longer turned to a distant, soft-handed bureaucrat in the capital. He turned to Yoritomo in Kamakura. With this, the Kamakura shogunate was born. It was a government built on the bedrock of land and loyalty. The samurai were no longer just hired swords or provincial enforcers. They were now a formal political class, bound to a central military authority. The sword was no longer just a tool of war. It was the instrument of law. As Yoritomo solidified his grip, the center of gravity in Japan shifted irrevocably. The elegance of the Heian period had been replaced by the austerity of the warrior. The world was no longer ruled by those who wrote the best poetry, but by those who commanded the most disciplined blades. The first shogunate had arrived, and with it, the blueprint for the next 7 centuries of Japanese rule. 1185 Kamakura. The architecture of power had been drafted, but now it had to be lived. To understand the Kamakura period, one must look past the grand declarations of title and look instead at the soil beneath a warrior's feet. This was the era of the *bakufu*, the tent government, a system that functioned less like a traditional state and more like a vast, interlocking web of personal contracts. At the core of this new reality was a fundamental, brutal exchange: land for loyalty. Under the old imperial system, land ownership was a dizzying labyrinth of tax rights, prestige, and overlapping claims held by aristocrats who had never stepped foot in a paddy field. But the Kamakura system stripped away the pretension. It was built on the relationship between the shogun and his Goknin *, his direct housemen. For a samurai, land was not merely wealth, it was existence. To hold a fief was to have the right to collect rice, to command labor, and to sustain a lineage. Yoritomo realized that if he could become the sole guarantor of these land rights, he would become indispensable. When a dispute arose over a boundary line or a harvest, the warrior did not petition a distant courtier in the capital, he petitioned the shogunate. The Bakufu established legal offices, such as the *Monchujo*, to adjudicate these claims. By providing justice, the shogun provided legitimacy. By providing legitimacy, the shogun commanded the sword. This created a rigid, vertical hierarchy that defined the samurai identity. At the top sat the shogun, the ultimate lord. Below him were the high-ranking vassals, and beneath them a cascading series of subordinates, all bound by the concept of asterisk go on asterisk and asterisk hoko. Go on was the favor bestowed by the Lord, most importantly the confirmation of land rights. Hoko was the service rendered in return, primarily military service and absolute unquestioning obedience. This was not a social contract based on abstract rights, it was a blood pact. If a vassal failed in his duty, his land was forfeited. If a lord failed to protect his vassal's interests, the bond was fractured. It was a high-stakes gamble that turned the provincial warrior into a disciplined political actor. This shift had profound implications for the very nature of the samurai. In the preceding eras, a warrior was often a man of necessity, a provincial strongman or a hired mercenary. But under the Kamakura system, the samurai became a professional class. They were no longer just fighters, they were administrators, tax collectors, and local governors. The lifestyle of the warrior began to coalesce around the values of the asterisk bakufu, austerity, discipline, and a singular focus on duty. The refinement of the court was replaced by the stoicism of the camp. However, this system was inherently fragile. It relied entirely on the strength of the shogun's personal authority to hold the web together. The peace was held not by a centralized bureaucracy, but by the mutual fear and mutual benefit of men with blades. As the Kamakura system matured, the tension between the central military authority and the distant, simmering resentment of the imperial court began to create a structural fault line in the heart of Japan. The stage was set for a period of unprecedented expansion, but also, inevitably, for the violent storms that would test the strength of this new order. 1274, Hakata Bay. The fragile peace of the Kamakura period was not shattered by internal rebellion, but by a shadow looming from the west. For centuries, Japan had existed in a state of relative isolation, its warriors perfecting the art of duels and ritualized combat. But the horizon was changing. Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, had conquered much of Asia, and his eyes were now fixed on the rising sun. The first invasion in 1274 was a profound shock to the Japanese psyche. The samurai, trained in the traditions of individual bravery and single combat, met a force that operated on an entirely different logic. The Mongols did not seek honorable duels. They fought with disciplined formations, massed archery, and, most terrifyingly, gunpowder bombs that exploded with a thunderous violence the Japanese had never encountered. The coastal defenses of Kyushu were overwhelmed. The samurai, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of provincial warfare, found themselves facing a whirlwind of coordinated aggression. Though the Mongols eventually withdrew, the psychological scar remained. The Kamakura shogunate, led by the Hojo clan, realized that the survival of the nation now depended on a total mobilization of the warrior class. In 1281, the second wave arrived, larger, more numerous, and more devastating. This was not merely a raid, it was an attempt at total conquest. The Japanese had spent the intervening years fortifying the coastlines, constructing massive stone walls known as Genko Borui to prevent the Mongol cavalry from landing. The ensuing battles were some of the bloodiest in Japanese history. The samurai fought with a desperate, suicidal ferocity, holding the lines against a sea of invaders. And then, as if summoned by the very desperation of the defenders, the heavens intervened. A massive typhoon tore through the Tsushima Strait, catching the Mongol fleets in its maw. Ships were smashed against the rocks, thousands drowned in the churning dark. To the Japanese, this was no mere weather event. It was divine intervention. They called it the kamikaze asterisk, the divine wind. It was seen as proof that the gods of Japan had looked down upon the defenders and chosen them to survive. But while the kamikaze had saved the islands, it had dealt a death blow to the Kamakura shogunate. Recall the fundamental engine of the Kamakura system, the exchange of go on and hoko. The warrior fought to earn the favor of his lord, specifically, the confirmation of his land rights. But the Mongol invasions were a defensive war. There was no new land to be conquered, no enemy territory to be seized and redistributed as spoils of victory. The samurai had bled, died, and spent their fortunes defending their homes, yet they returned to a shogunate that had nothing to give them in return. The Bakufu found itself in an impossible position. They could not reward the loyalty of their goznen with land, and they could not pay them with gold. The debt of gratitude had become a vacuum. As the warriors' resentment grew, the social contract that held the shogunate together began to unravel. The blood pact was broken, not by a lack of courage, but by a lack of resources. The divine wind had repelled the Mongols, but it had also blown away the foundations of the military government. The Kamakura system, built on the promise of land and reward, was now a hollow shell, drifting toward an inevitable and chaotic collapse. 1336 Kyoto. The collapse of the Kamakura system was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing erosion. As the Hojo regents lost their grip on the provincial warrior class, the vacuum of power was filled by a new kind of ambition. From the chaos emerged Ashikaga Takoji, a brilliant and opportunistic general who had once served the very forces he would eventually overthrow. By seizing Kyoto and establishing a new military government, Takoji didn't just replace one shogun with another. He fundamentally altered the DNA of Japanese governance. This was the dawn of the Muromachi period, and with it, the rise of the Ashikaga shogunate. Unlike the Kamakura shogunate, which had been a centralized military dictatorship rooted in the rugged terrain of the East, the Ashikaga rule was a delicate, often precarious, dance of diplomacy and cultural refinement. The Ashikaga shoguns did not rule by absolute command. They ruled through a complex web of alliances with powerful regional lords, the Shugo asterisk. These governors held vast territories, and their loyalty was not a given. It was a commodity to be bought, negotiated, and maintained. This inherent political fragility created a unique paradox, a period of unparalleled cultural splendor existing alongside a foundation of profound instability. While the shoguns struggled to maintain control over the distant provinces, the capital of Kyoto transformed into the beating heart of Japanese aesthetics. The Ashikaga era was a golden age of refinement. It was during this time that the austere beauty of Zen Buddhism began to seep into every facet of life. The tea ceremony, or chanoyu, evolved from a simple medicinal ritual into a highly codified spiritual art form. The concept of wabi sabi finding beauty in imperfection and transience, became the philosophical bedrock of the age. The arts flourished in the shadows of political maneuvering. No theater with its haunting masks and slow, deliberate movements reached its zenith. Ink-wash painting, influenced by Chinese Song dynasty styles, captured the Zen ideal of simplicity. Even the very architecture of the era shifted, moving toward the elegant, understated grace that would define Japanese design for centuries to come. To the eyes of a scholar or an artist, the Muromachi period was a peak of human expression. But look beneath the silk robes and the tranquil tea gardens, and you would find a landscape of fractured authority. Because the Ashikaga shoguns relied so heavily on the *Shugo* to manage the provinces, they inadvertently empowered the very people who would eventually dismantle their power. As these regional lords grew wealthier and more autonomous, they began to act less like governors and more like independent kings. The central authority in Kyoto became increasingly ceremonial, a glittering court of poets and monks that held little sway over the reality of the countryside. The splendor of the Ashikaga was a thin veneer. Beneath it, the seeds of the Sengoku Jidai the age of warring states, were already being sown. The system of land tenure was breaking down, and the competition for territory was becoming increasingly violent. The Ashikaga had successfully bridged the gap between the old imperial world and the new warrior world, but in doing so, they had created a structure that was too beautiful to be strong and too complex to be stable. The stage was set for a descent into a century of fire and blood. 1336 Kyoto. As the Ashikaga shogunate struggled to maintain its grip on a fracturing nation, a profound transformation was occurring within the minds of the men who held the swords. If the previous era had been defined by the raw, provincial grit of the Kamakura warriors, the Muromachi period introduced a new, more complex identity. This was the era where the warrior ceased to be merely a killer and began to transform into a philosopher-soldier. At the heart of this metamorphosis lay Zen Buddhism. Unlike the more ritualistic and salvation-oriented sects of esoteric Buddhism that had long dominated the imperial courts, Zen offered something visceral, immediate, and strikingly practical. It did not demand the study of vast, complex sutras or the indulgence in elaborate ceremonies. Instead, Zen demanded discipline, direct experience, and most importantly, the mastery of the self. For a class of men whose lives were defined by the constant possibility of sudden, violent death, Zen provided a psychological toolkit unlike any other. The core tenets of Zen, meditation, mindfulness, and the pursuit of emptiness, resonated deeply with the realities of the battlefield. To a samurai, the ability to clear the mind of fear, doubt, and even the instinct for self-preservation was not just a spiritual goal, it was a tactical necessity. In the heat of combat, a single moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt, or a surge of uncontrolled emotion could mean the difference between life and death. Zen taught the warrior how to achieve *mushin*, or no mind, a state of spontaneous, instinctive action where the ego vanishes and the body moves with the fluid precision of nature. This spiritual discipline began to bleed into the very fabric of samurai culture, creating a unique synthesis of violence and tranquility. The martial arts were no longer viewed merely as techniques of slaughter, but as paths toward spiritual enlightenment. The way of the sword, or kenjutsu *, became a form of moving meditation. The discipline required to master a blade was seen as identical to the discipline required to master one's own soul. This fusion of the blade and the mind gave rise to a distinct aesthetic that would define the samurai identity for centuries. The Zen influence permeated the warrior's lifestyle, from the austere simplicity of their dwellings to the meticulous care they took in the tea ceremony. The concept of wabi-sabi the appreciation of the transient, the imperfect, and the weathered, became a way for the warrior to reconcile the brutality of his profession with the fleeting nature of existence. A chipped tea bowl or a single falling cherry blossom became profound symbols of the impermanence of life, a concept the samurai faced every single day. However, this cultural refinement was a double-edged sword. While Zen provided the psychological fortitude to endure the coming storms, it also fostered an individualistic fatalism. The acceptance of death as an inevitable, natural transition allowed the warrior to fight with a terrifying, almost suicidal ferocity. As the Ashikaga authority continued to crumble, this new, spiritually hardened warrior class was no longer content to serve as mere provincial enforcers. They were becoming a class of autonomous, highly disciplined, and ideologically driven elites. The refinement of the Zen mind was about to meet the chaos of the battlefield, and the result would be a descent into a level of organized warfare the likes of which Japan had never seen. 1467, Kyoto. The air in the capital, once thick with the scent of incense and the refined poetry of the court, was now choked with the acrid stench of smoke and the copper tang of blood. The delicate balance that the Ashikaga shogunate had attempted to maintain, a fragile equilibrium between the central authority in Kyoto and the ambitious provincial lords, had finally snapped. What began as a localized dispute over succession within the Ashikaga family ignited a spark that would consume the entire nation. This was the Anin War. For a decade, the streets of Kyoto were transformed into a wasteland of charred timber and corpses. This was not a war of grand strategic maneuvers or sweeping territorial conquests. It was a war of attrition, a brutal, grinding conflict fought house to house, alleyway to alleyway. The capital, the cultural heart of Japan, was systematically dismantled. As the great temples burned and the aristocratic estates fell into ruin, the central government's power evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The shogun, once the arbiter of national law, became a mere figurehead, a prisoner of the very chaos he was meant to prevent. But the true horror of the Anin War lay not just in the destruction of Kyoto, but in its consequences. As the shogunate's authority collapsed, the legal and social glue holding the provinces together dissolved. The vacuum left by the central government was instantly filled by a predatory surge of local ambition. The provincial clans, once mere vassals, realized that the mandate of heaven was no longer held by a single lineage in Kyoto, but by whoever possessed the sharpest steel and the most disciplined men. Japan was no longer a unified nation under a singular military banner. It had fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. The era of organized, central governance was over, and the era of the Sengoku Jidai asterisk, the age of warring states, had begun. The landscape of Japan was redrawn by the sword. In every corner of the archipelago, powerful local lords, known as daimyo began to assert their independence. These were no longer just administrators of land. They were sovereign warlords, building massive mountain fortresses and raising private armies to defend their borders and expand their influence. The old hierarchies were discarded in favor of a terrifying new reality, Gekkokujo asterisk, or the low overcoming the high. In this new world, merit, cunning, and raw military might were the only currencies that mattered. A loyal retainer could overthrow his lord. A peasant could rise to command a battalion. A brilliant strategist could topple a dynasty. The Anin War had acted as a great divider. It had shattered the illusion of a stable, ordered Japan and replaced it with a Darwinian struggle for survival. The spiritual discipline of Zen, which we have seen cultivate the no mind of the individual warrior, was now being scaled up to the level of entire clans. The ferocity of the individual was being harnessed into the machinery of total war. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of Kyoto, the realization set in. The peace of the old world was dead. Japan had entered a century of darkness, a period where the only constant was conflict, and the only path to stability was through the total unification of a broken land. The stage was set for the rise of the great unifiers, but first, the nation would have to bleed. 1467, the provinces of Japan. The collapse of the Ashikaga authority did not merely change the government, it fundamentally altered the DNA of Japanese society. As the central administration withered, the concept of Japan as a singular political entity became a phantom. In its place emerged a patchwork of microstates, a fractured mosaic of borders where every mountain pass and river crossing became a potential site of bloodshed. This was the true heart of the Sengoku Jidai, a state of permanent, localized, and escalating warfare. To understand this era, one must understand the daimyo. These were no longer the refined aristocrats of the Heian period, nor even the traditional provincial deputies of the Kamakura era. The Sengoku daimyo were self-made sovereigns. They were masters of logistics, architects of fortification, and relentless predators. Their legitimacy did not stem from imperial decrees or ancient lineage, but from their ability to protect their peasants, feed their armies, and crush their neighbors. Under the principle of Gekko Kujo asterisk, the low overcoming the high, the social ladder had become a vertical battlefield. In the old order, status was a birthright. In the Sengoku era, status was a prize to be seized. This social mobility, while violent and chaotic, birthed a new breed of warrior. The samurai class was no longer a closed circle of elite bloodlines. It became a meritocracy of the blade. A man born of nothing could, through sheer tactical brilliance or unwavering ferocity, command thousands. This shift created a culture of intense competition, where every battle was a gamble for survival, and every victory was a stepping stone toward greater hegemony. The geography of Japan itself began to transform to meet this new demand for security. The landscape was being punctuated by the rise of the Japanese castle. No longer were fortifications mere wooden palisades or simple hilltop mounds. As the scale of warfare expanded, so did the complexity of defense. Warlords poured their wealth into massive stone foundations, intricate labyrinthine gate systems, and soaring keeps designed to withstand months of siege. These castles became more than military outposts. They became the nuclei of new urban centers, the seats of power around which commerce and culture would eventually coalesce. Yet the Sengoku Jidai was not merely a chronicle of battles. It was a period of profound adaptation. The constant state of mobilization forced a revolution in how land was managed and how armies were raised. The traditional reliance on elite mounted cavalry began to give way to the massive infantry blocks of the Ashigaru asterisk, foot soldiers, often drawn from the peasantry themselves. This democratization of violence meant that wars were no longer the private disputes of a few noble houses. They were total conflicts that involved the entire fabric of the province. As the decades ground on, the scale of the conflict grew. What began as skirmishes between neighbors escalated into massive, multi-front campaigns involving tens of thousands of men. The sheer exhaustion of the land was palpable. Provinces were bled dry by constant taxation and scorched earth tactics. Japan was a coiled spring, a nation defined by a relentless, grinding motion of expansion and contraction. The chaos was absolute, but within that chaos, a new order was being forged in the fires of constant combat. The era of the warlords had created a vacuum of power so vast, and a hunger for order so profound, that only a singular, overwhelming force could hope to fill it. 1550, the Warring Provinces. As the Sengoku period progressed, the nature of conflict underwent a radical transformation. The romanticized image of the lone samurai, dueling his equal on horseback in a display of individual martial prowess, was being systematically dismantled by the grim realities of large-scale attrition. War was no longer a series of ritualized skirmishes. It had become a science of mass mobilization, engineering, and logistics. At the heart of this evolution stood the Japanese castle. During this era, the Yamashiro asterisk, or mountain castle, began to evolve into the more formidable asterisk Her Yamashiro asterisk, situated on plains or hills to control vital trade routes and agricultural basins. These were not merely residences for the daimyo. They were complex, multi-layered machines of war. Architects designed maze-like, labyrinthine paths to funnel attackers into killing zones, where they could be rained upon by arrows and, increasingly, arquebus fire. The introduction of massive stone walls, or ishigaki, changed the geometry of defense. These sloping walls were designed to be both stable against earthquakes and nearly impossible to scale, forcing attackers into predictable, deadly bottlenecks. A castle was a statement of permanence in a world of flux. To hold a castle was to hold the very soul of a province. But a castle is only as strong as the force that surrounds it, and the siege was the ultimate test of a warlord's resolve. To capture a stronghold, the traditional methods of direct assault were often too costly. Instead, the art of the siege became a psychological and logistical game of starvation. Warlords utilized Hyoro's the strategy of encirclement, to cut off all supply lines, turning a fortress into a tomb. Engineers developed sophisticated siege engines, and specialized units were trained to undermine walls or launch fire arrows to ignite the wooden structures within. The siege was a slow, grinding process of attrition that could last months, testing the discipline of the defenders and the patience of the attackers. Crucial to these massive, prolonged campaigns was the emergence of the Ashigaru asterisk. If the samurai were the scalpel of the Sengoku era, the Ashigaru were the sledgehammer. Originally meaning light feet, these were peasant soldiers, conscripted from the very rice fields they once tilled. Unlike the elite samurai, who fought for honor and individual glory, the Ashigaru fought as a collective unit. They moved in disciplined ranks, forming the backbone of the infantry blocks that now dominated the battlefield. The arrival of the matchlock musket, or Tangashima, revolutionized their role. No longer was a soldier required to spend a lifetime mastering the bow or the sword to be effective. A peasant could be trained in a matter of weeks to operate a firearm, providing a terrifyingly efficient way to project lethal force in massed volleys. This shift fundamentally altered the social hierarchy of combat. The sheer volume of fire produced by thousands of Ashigaru could shatter the most legendary cavalry charges. This was the new reality of Japanese warfare, a collision of stone and gunpowder, of massive fortifications and massed infantry. The battlefield had become a place of industrial-scale death, where victory was determined not by the courage of a single hero, but by the strength of a warlord's supply lines, the ingenuity of his engineers, and the sheer number of disciplined feet he could bring to bear upon the earth. 1560, Owerri Province. Amidst this landscape of industrial-scale death and shifting tactical doctrines, a new kind of predator emerged from the chaos. While many daimyo remained tethered to the traditions of their ancestors, clinging to the old codes of individual martial glory, one man saw the Sengoku period not as a cycle of endless war, but as a broken machine that required a singular, iron will to rebuild. His name was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was not a man of elegance or quiet contemplation. He was often described by his contemporaries as a fool, a reckless, unpredictable, and often brutal figure who disregarded the social niceties of the ruling class. But beneath this veneer of eccentricity lay a mind of terrifying strategic clarity. He understood something that his rivals did not, that the era of the individual warrior was dead, and the era of the total state had begun. Nobunaga's ascent began in earnest at the Battle of Okazama. Faced with an overwhelming force from the mighty Imagawa clan, Nobunaga did not rely on a standard defensive posture. Instead, he leveraged the chaos of a sudden thunderstorm to launch a daring precision strike directly at the enemy's command center. It was a gamble of astronomical proportions, but its success signaled a shift in the winds of history. The Fool of Owerri had become a contender for the hegemony of Japan. Where other warlords sought only to expand their borders, Nobunaga sought to dismantle the very structures that fueled the chaos. He recognized that the fractured power of the Buddhist monasteries and the ancient prestige of the imperial court were obstacles to absolute centralized control. To Nobunaga, authority was not a divine right to be inherited. It was a commodity to be seized and enforced through overwhelming force. He became a master of the very technologies that had redefined the battlefield. While others viewed the arquebus as a secondary weapon, Nobunaga integrated it into the heart of his doctrine. He pioneered the use of rotating volley fire, a method where ranks of ashigaru would fire in succession, creating a continuous curtain of lead that prevented the enemy from regrouping. At the Battle of Nagashino, this tactical innovation, combined with his sophisticated use of defensive palisades, effectively annihilated the legendary cavalry of the Taikta clan, proving once and for all that gunpowder and discipline could overcome even the most storied martial traditions. But Nobunaga's ambition extended far beyond the battlefield. He was a pioneer of economic warfare. He implemented rakuza**, or free markets, breaking the monopolies held by powerful merchant guilds and religious institutions. By stimulating trade and removing internal barriers, he ensured that his war machine was fueled by a growing, liquid economy. He was building a state that was not just militarily superior, but structurally indestructible. Nobunaga was the great unifier's first, most violent movement. He was the storm that cleared the forest to make way for a new order. He did not seek to play by the rules of the Sengoku period. He sought to burn the rulebook entirely. As he marched toward Kyoto, his goal was clear: the total unification of Japan under a single, absolute authority. The age of the warring provinces was ending, and the age of the Iron Dictator had begun. 1582, Honnō-ji Temple. The storm that was Oda Nobunaga did not end with a glorious conquest, but with a sudden, violent betrayal. In the flickering shadows of a temple fire, the man who sought to burn the old world to the ground was consumed by his own general, Akechi Mitsuhide. With Nobunaga's death, the dream of a unified Japan seemed to fracture once more, teetering on the edge of a renewed descent into chaos. But as the smoke cleared over the ruins of Kyoto, a new figure emerged from the shadow of the fallen tyrant, a man whose rise defied every law of the social order. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. If Nobunaga was the storm, Hideyoshi was the rising tide. His origins were not found in the halls of ancestral castles or the lineages of prestigious samurai clans, but in the dirt of the rice paddies. Born a nameless peasant, perhaps a foot soldier or a simple laborer, Hideyoshi possessed nothing to his name but a sharp wit, an uncanny ability to read people, and a relentless, kinetic energy. In a society defined by rigid caste and inherited status, he was an impossibility. Hideyoshi's ascent began not with a grand charge but with his service to Nobunaga. He was not a master of the sword but a master of logistics and diplomacy. Where others saw only the battlefield, Hideyoshi saw the supply lines, the fortifications, and the psychology of negotiation. He became Nobunaga's monkey, a nickname that spoke to his restless nature, but he was a monkey with the mind of a grandmaster. He rose through the ranks through sheer utility, managing the complex machinery of Nobunaga's growing state, proving that in this new era, intellect and adaptability were becoming as lethal as any blade. When the betrayal at Honnōji struck, Hideyoshi did not succumb to despair. Instead, he executed one of the most rapid and decisive military campaigns in Japanese history. The Great Chugoku Retreat saw him march his forces across vast distances with terrifying speed, catching the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide off guard and crushing him at the Battle of Yamazaki. In a single stroke, the peasant-born soldier had transformed himself from a mere vassal into the most powerful man in the realm. Yet Hideyoshi understood that raw military force was insufficient to hold a nation. He knew that to prevent the Sengoku period from returning, he had to do more than win battles. He had to rewrite the social contract of Japan. He could not claim the title of shogun, the traditional military title reserved for those of high martial lineage, so he sought a different kind of legitimacy. Through marriage alliances and political maneuvering, he became the Kampaku asterisk, the imperial regent. He bridged the gap between the warrior class and the ancient prestige of the imperial court, legitimizing his rule through the very institutions Nobunaga had sought to dismantle. He was a man of contradictions, a commoner who commanded the highest nobility, a diplomat who governed through iron-fisted control, and a builder who rose from the mud. Hideyoshi did not just inherit Nobunaga's revolution, he refined it, turning a chaotic conquest into a structured, centralized state. The era of the great unifier had arrived, and the foundations of a new, unified Japan were being laid in stone, blood, and gold. 1588, Osaka Castle. The air in the halls of power was thick with a new kind of ambition. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had achieved what seemed impossible. He had stitched the fractured provinces of Japan back together. The fires of the Sengoku Jidai were being extinguished, replaced by the heavy, structured silence of a centralized state. But Hideyoshi, the man who had climbed from the mud to the heavens, knew a fundamental truth that his predecessors had often ignored. A nation held together by the sword is only as stable as the hands that hold them. For over a century, Japan had been a land of constant motion. The distinction between the man who plowed the field and the man who wielded the spear was dangerously thin. In the chaos of the warring states, a clever farmer could become a warlord, and a desperate peasant could rise as a bandit, toppling local lords with nothing but grit and stolen steel. This fluidity was the engine of the Sengoku era, but for Hideyoshi, It was the greatest threat to the peace he had fought so hard to build. To ensure that the chaos never returned, he realized he had to do more than conquer the daimyo. He had to freeze the social order in place. This realization manifested in one of the most transformative and controversial decrees in Japanese history, the Katanagari Asterisk, or the Great Sword Hunt. The mandate was absolute. Hideyoshi ordered that all weapons, swords, spears, matchlock guns, and even hidden daggers, be surrendered by the peasantry. The command was issued with terrifying clarity. Any commoner found in possession of a blade would be subject to execution. This was not merely a policy of disarmament. It was a surgical strike against the very possibility of social mobility. Imagine the scene across the countryside. Imperial officials and samurai officers descended upon villages, their shadows lengthening over rice paddies and thatched roofs. They moved from hamlet to hamlet, conducting systematic searches. They tore up floorboards, dug beneath hearths, and searched the tools of daily labor. The steel that had been passed down through families, or forged in secret to protect a village from bandits, was gathered in massive, clattering heaps. For the peasant, the sword hunt was a profound psychological blow. To be disarmed was to be rendered helpless, stripped of the means to defend one's home, or, more importantly, to rebel against the tax collector or the local lord. It was the final, decisive blow to the era of the warrior peasant. By separating the tools of production from the tools of destruction, Hideyoshi was drawing a permanent line in the sand. The decree effectively codified the four-class system that would define Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. It created a world where the samurai were the only ones permitted to carry the soul of the nation, the sword, while the farmers, artisans, and merchants were relegated to their roles, bound to the earth and the economy. Hideyoshi had successfully performed a grand act of social alchemy. He had turned a nation of restless, armed combatants into a disciplined, stratified society. The era of the wandering warrior was over. The era of the rigid, unshakable hierarchy had begun. The peace was secured, but it was a peace forged in the cold reality of total control. 1592, the Tsushima Strait. The peace Hideyoshi had so meticulously constructed within Japan's borders was about to be shattered, not by internal rebellion, but by an outward explosion of monumental violence. The Great Sword Hunt had achieved its goal. It had pacified the Japanese people and anchored the samurai to their roles. But for the thousands of battle-hardened warriors who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of slaughter, this new, rigid peace was a cage. They were a class defined by conflict, now relegated to garrisoning castles and managing tax rolls. Hideyoshi, ever the master of redirection, understood that a restless military class was a dangerous one. He needed a new direction for their ambition, a new frontier to conquer. His eyes turned toward the Korean peninsula. Hideyoshi's vision was nothing short of megalomaniacal. He did not merely want to influence the East. He sought to conquer the Ming dynasty of China, the great hegemon of Asia. To reach the heart of the Middle Kingdom, he believed he first had to break the Korean kingdom of Joseon. His demands to the Korean court were absurd, bordering on the delusional. He demanded passage through their lands and the submission of their sovereignty. When the Korean diplomats refused, the engines of war were set in motion. In the spring of 1592, a massive armada of Japanese vessels choked the coastline, carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This was not the localized skirmishing of the Sengoku period. This was a total war of conquest. The Japanese forces, led by seasoned generals, utilized their superior experience in gunpowder warfare and the devastating efficiency of the arquebus to tear through the Korean defenses with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the capital of Seoul had fallen. The Korean king fled north, and it seemed as though Hideyoshi's dream of a continental empire was within his grasp. However, the Japanese underestimated two critical factors: the sheer resilience of the Korean people and the arrival of Ming China's intervention. As the Japanese pushed further north, they found themselves bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war. The Korean people, led by legendary naval commanders like Yi Sun-sin, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. On the seas, the Korean Navy utilized ingenious turtle ships, armored vessels that tore through the Japanese supply lines, turning the ocean into a graveyard for Hideyoshi's ambitions. The war devolved into a grueling, bloody stalemate. What began as a lightning strike became a protracted war of attrition that drained the resources of Japan and devastated the Korean landscape. The peninsula became a scorched earth of broken cities and starving populations. By the time Hideyoshi passed away in 1598, the invasion had lost its driving force. The Japanese forces began a massive withdrawal, leaving behind a legacy of immense suffering and deep-seated geopolitical resentment. The Imjin War had been a colossal gamble, a grand attempt to export Japan's internal violence to the world stage. It had failed to conquer China, but it had succeeded in something else. It had exposed the immense cost of Hideyoshi's ambition and signaled the beginning of the end for his era. The dragon had roared, but the world had not bowed. 1598 Kyoto. As the smoke of the Imjin War cleared and the life of Toyotomi Hideyoshi began to flicker toward its inevitable end, a profound question remained. How would his legacy be remembered? While his dreams of a continental empire had crumbled in the mud and blood of the Korean peninsula, his impact on the very soul of Japan was etched in something far more permanent than a military conquest. It was etched in stone, gold, and cedar. To understand the era of Hideyoshi, one must understand the Momoyama period, a brief, explosive window of history where the austerity of the warring states gave way to an unprecedented fever of opulence. This was the era of Momoyama architecture, a style designed not for survival but for intimidation. It was an architecture of pure, unadulterated grandeur. If the preceding Sengoku period was defined by the functional, rugged fortresses built for defense, the Momoyama style was defined by the theater of power. The goal was no longer just to keep an enemy out, but to make them tremble upon entry. This was a visual language of absolute authority. The centerpiece of this movement was the Japanese castle, but these were no longer mere military garrisons. They had become palatial monuments. Imagine the towering stone ramparts of Osaka Castle or Fushimi Castle, vast, intimidating structures that dominated the skyline, signaling to every peasant and daimyo that the era of chaos was over and the era of the unifier had arrived. Inside these fortresses, the transition from martial utility to artistic excess was even more jarring. The Momoyama aesthetic embraced a philosophy of gold and shadow. The interiors of these great halls were often lined with massive, sliding fusuma doors, transformed into sprawling masterpieces by the hands of the Kano school of painters. These screens did not depict the quiet, Zen-inspired landscapes of the past. Instead, they exploded with vibrant gold leaf, ferocious tigers, soaring dragons, and towering pine trees. The gold served a dual purpose. It reflected the dim light of flickering candles to create a divine, supernatural glow, and it served as a literal display of unimaginable wealth. This was a period of extravagant simplicity, clashing with monumental excess, while the tea ceremony, refined by masters like Sen no Rikyu, offered a quiet, rustic sanctuary of shadows and earthen bowls. The ruling elite used that very same aesthetic to create a tension between the spiritual and the material. They built grand tea rooms that were masterpieces of understated elegance, only to surround them with massive, gilded audience halls that screamed of worldly dominance. Momoyama architecture was the physical manifestation of Hideyoshi's meteoric rise. It was the style of a man who had started as a peasant and ended as the master of a nation. Every gilded beam and every soaring roofline was a statement. I am here, I am absolute, and I cannot be ignored. It was a final, brilliant flare of light before the transition to the more controlled, restrained, and bureaucratic stability of the Tokugawa shogunate. The age of the warlord was fading, but through its architecture, the Momoyama era ensured that its splendor would never be forgotten. 1549, Kagoshima. While the grand gilded halls of the Momoyama period were being constructed to project domestic power, a different kind of influence was washing upon the shores of Japan, one that arrived not with the roar of cannons, but with the rhythmic tolling of church bells and the silent footsteps of Jesuit missionaries. To the Japanese of the 16th century, these newcomers were unlike anything they had ever encountered. They were the Nanban, the southern barbarians. They arrived on massive, high-walled carracks that dwarfed the local coastal vessels, their sails billowing like the wings of strange white birds. These were the Portuguese, the first Europeans to breach the isolation of the Japanese archipelago, and they brought with them a tide of change that would challenge the very foundations of the social and spiritual order. The Nanban trade was a whirlwind of unprecedented novelty. Along with the missionaries came a flood of exotic goods that ignited the curiosity of the ruling elite. For the first time, Japan was introduced to European glassware, fine textiles, and intricate clocks. But perhaps most transformative was the introduction of firearms. While the matchlock musket had already begun to trickle into Japan via traders, the sophisticated weaponry and tactical knowledge brought by the Europeans accelerated a military revolution, fundamentally altering the way wars were fought in the Sengoku period. Yet beneath the veneer of silk and gunpowder lay a much deeper, more volatile element: Christianity. Led by figures like Francis Xavier, the Jesuit mission sought to plant the seeds of the Catholic faith in a land steeped in the traditions of Buddhism and Shinto. To many Japanese, the Christian message of a single, all-powerful God and the promise of salvation offered a compelling spiritual alternative. The faith spread with surprising speed, particularly among the peasantry and some of the lower-ranking daimyo, who saw in Christianity a way to bypass the established Buddhist hierarchies that had long been intertwined with the state. For a time, the great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga and later Toyotomi Hideyoshi, viewed the Nanban with a pragmatic eye. Nobunaga, in particular, showed a remarkable tolerance, if not a genuine fascination, with the foreign presence. He saw the Christians as a useful counterbalance to the powerful Buddhist sects that had frequently challenged his authority. To Nobunaga, the Nanban were a source of wealth, technology, and a political tool to further consolidate his grip on the nation. However, this tolerance was fragile. As the dream of a unified Japan began to take shape, the presence of a foreign ideology that demanded primary loyalty to a heavenly king rather than the Japanese ruler began to look less like a novelty and more like a threat. The very thing that had fueled the Momoyama era's appetite for the exotic, the connection to the wider world, was now introducing a seed of potential subversion. The arrival of the Nanban had opened a door that could not easily be closed, creating a tension between the desire for foreign wealth and the desperate need for cultural and political homogeneity. It was a collision of worlds that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in Japanese history. October 21, 1600, Sekigahara. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Momoyama period, the friction between foreign influence, religious fervor, and the raw pursuit of power, finally reached its breaking point. The death of the great unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, in 1598 had left a vacuum that no amount of gilded architecture could fill. The nation, once unified under his iron grip, was now a powder keg waiting for a single spark. That spark arrived in the form of a massive, inevitable collision between two titans of the Sengoku era, Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari. As the sun rose over the fog-drenched valley of Sekigahara, the landscape was transformed into a chessboard of mortal consequence. On one side stood the Eastern Army, led by the calculating, patient, and seasoned Tokugawa Ieyasu. His aim was nothing less than the total hegemony of Japan. Opposing him was the Western Army, a coalition of daimyo fighting under the banner of the Toyotomi legacy, led by the fiercely loyal and principled Ishida Mitsunari. This was not merely a battle between men, but a clash of philosophies. It was a struggle to decide whether Japan would be ruled by the old guard of the Toyotomi Regency, or by the new, disciplined order that Ieyasu promised to forge. The scale of the conflict was staggering. Thousands of samurai, tens of thousands of ashigaru, and the thunderous roar of matchlock muskets, the very weapons introduced by the Nanban, filled the valley. The morning began with a chaotic symphony of steel on steel and the rhythmic discharge of gunpowder. For hours the lines held. The fog clung to the mountainsides, obscuring the movements of great clans, making the battlefield a labyrinth of sudden, violent encounters. Yet the true drama of Sekigahara was not fought with blades but with shadows. In the high-stakes game of feudal politics, loyalty was often a fluid commodity. As the battle raged, the outcome hung in a delicate balance. The Western Army seemed poised to hold their ground, their position tactically superior, until the moment of the great betrayal. Kobayakawa Hidaki, a young daimyo positioned on the heights overlooking the battlefield, held the key to the entire engagement. For much of the morning he remained motionless, his indecision a heavy weight upon both commanders. But Ieyasu, ever the master of psychological warfare, did not wait for fate. He ordered his arquebusiers to fire toward Kobayakawa's position, not to kill him, but to force his hand. The signal was given. Instead of charging the Eastern Army, Kobayakawa turned his massive force downward, plunging into the flank of his own allies in the Western Army. This sudden, treacherous pivot shattered the cohesion of Mitsunari's forces. The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. Panic, more lethal than any blade, swept through the Western ranks. What had begun as a structured contest of martial honor dissolved into a desperate, bloody rout. By the time the sun began to set over the blood-soaked fields of Sekigahara, the era of chaos was effectively over. The Western Army was broken, and the path to absolute power lay open before Tokugawa Ieyasu. The battle had been the decisive turning point. It was the moment the gears of history shifted, moving Japan away from the volatile uncertainty of the Sengoku period and toward the long, disciplined, and isolated peace of the Tokugawa shogunate. March 24, 1603, Edo. The smoke of Sekigahara had long since cleared, but the scent of blood and ambition still lingered in the Japanese air. For over a century, the islands had been defined by the rhythm of the drumbeat and the scream of the war cry. But as Tokugawa Ieyasu sat within the walls of his burgeoning stronghold in Edo, he was no longer merely a warlord seeking victory. He was a statesman seeking permanence. In 1603, the emperor formally granted him the title of shogun, signaling the birth of a new era. The era of the Tokugawa shogunate had begun. If Oda Nobunaga was the fire that consumed the old world, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the hand that shaped the new one, then Tokugawa Ieyasu was the stone that would hold it all in place. He was a man defined by a terrifying, almost inhuman patience. Where his predecessors had been driven by the frantic urge for conquest, Ieyasu was driven by the desire for structure. He understood a fundamental truth that his rivals had ignored. A nation built solely on martial prowess is a nation destined to collapse under its own violence. To rule Japan, he would not just need to defeat his enemies, he would need to domesticate them. Ieyasu's genius lay in his ability to transform the very nature of power. He did not seek to eradicate the daimyo, the great territorial lords who had spent generations fighting for supremacy. Instead, he sought to weave them into a web of such intricate complexity that rebellion became a mathematical impossibility. He began the monumental task of building a bureaucracy of control, turning the fierce, independent warriors of the Sengoku period into disciplined administrators of the state. He understood that stability required more than just an army. It required a social architecture. He began to implement a rigid hierarchy that would define Japanese life for the next 2.5 centuries. By formalizing the four-class system, separating the samurai, the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants, he sought to freeze the social order in place, ensuring that every man knew his place, his duty, and his limits. But Ieyasu's most profound achievement was the creation of a political ecosystem that prioritized survival over glory. He knew that the greatest threat to his peace was the concentration of wealth and military might in the hands of a single rival. Thus, he began to engineer a system of checks and balances that would eventually evolve into the Sankinkatai, the system of alternate attendance, ensuring the lords were always under his watchful eye. He was the architect of a great peace, a period of stillness that would allow culture, commerce, and philosophy to bloom in the vacuum left by the sword. Yet, this peace came at a cost, the cost of absolute control. The freedom of the warring states was traded for the security of the Tokugawa cage. As Ieyasu laid the foundations of his regime, he was not just building a government, he was crafting a closed system, a masterpiece of political engineering designed to endure long after his own heart had ceased to beat. The era of the warrior was fading. The era of the bureaucrat had arrived. 1603, Edo. The city was little more than a swampy, fortified marshland, a collection of muddy streets and wooden palisades tucked away on the eastern edge of Honshu. To the ancient aristocrats in Kyoto, Edo was a backwater, a rugged outpost far removed from the refined elegance of the imperial court. But to Tokugawa Ieyasu, it was the perfect crucible. It was a blank canvas upon which he could paint a new reality. As the shogunate took root, Edo underwent a transformation unlike any other in Japanese history. What was once a provincial garrison began to swell into a sprawling, hyper-organized metropolis. This was not a city that grew by accident. It was a city built by decree. Ieyasu and his successors understood that to maintain political dominance, they needed a center of gravity that was entirely beholden to the Tokugawa. By shifting the seat of actual power from the ceremonial splendor of Kyoto to the functional, fortified streets of Edo, the shogunate effectively decoupled the military government from the influence of the emperor. The emperor would remain the sun, distant, sacred, and ornamental, but the shogun was the gravity that held the world in orbit. This new order required more than just stone walls and canals. It required a radical reimagining of how a society functions. Under the Tokugawa, the chaotic fluidity of the Sengoku period was replaced by a terrifyingly precise social geometry. This was the implementation of the Shinokosho asterisk, the four-tier class system. At the apex sat the samurai, the warrior administrators who held the monopoly on violence and political office. Below them were the peasants, the vital backbone of the economy, tasked with the heavy burden of rice production. Then came the artisans, the makers of things, and finally, at the very bottom, the merchants. On the surface, this hierarchy was designed to ensure stability. By tying a person's identity, occupation, and even the clothes they could wear to their birth, the shogunate sought to eliminate the social mobility that had fueled the fires of civil war. If everyone stayed in their lane, the roads of the nation would remain peaceful. However, the true genius of the Edo order lay in its ability to monitor the very men who could dismantle it, the daimyo. Ieyasu knew that even a peaceful lord could harbor the ambitions of a conqueror. To solve this, the shogunate perfected a system of institutionalized hostage-taking known as *sankinkatai*, or alternate attendance. Every major lord was required to spend every other year living in Edo, and when they returned to their own domains, they were forced to leave their wives and heirs behind in the shogun's capital. This was a masterstroke of political attrition. The sheer cost of maintaining two lavish residences and traveling in massive, ceremonial processions between them drained the daimyo's treasuries, leaving them with no surplus wealth to fund an uprising. It turned the lords into perpetual guests of the shogun, transforming potential rebels into exhausted travelers. As the streets of Edo grew wider and the canals more complex, the city became a living machine of control. The shogunate had succeeded. They had moved beyond the era of the battlefield and into the era of the ledger. The chaos of the past had been paved over, replaced by a rigid, beautiful, and suffocatingly stable new world. 1603, Edo. But to understand the gears of this machine, one must look beyond the stone walls of the shogun's castle and into the very soul of the Japanese people. This stability was not maintained by steel alone, but by a profound philosophical architecture, Neo-Confucianism. As the smoke of the Sengoku Wars cleared, the Tokugawa shogunate did not merely seek to rule the land, they sought to rule the mind. They turned to the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, adapting his ideas into a rigid moral framework that emphasized harmony, filial piety, and most crucially, the importance of knowing one's place. In the eyes of the shogunate, social chaos was a symptom of moral disorder. To restore peace, the state had to impose a cosmic order upon the earthly realm. This was the birth of the Shinokosho system, a four-tiered hierarchy that attempted to freeze time itself. At the summit of this pyramid stood the samurai. They were no longer merely the rugged warriors of the battlefield. They were being transformed into a class of scholar administrators. Under the new Neo-Confucian doctrine, the samurai were the moral compass of the nation. They held the exclusive right to carry two swords and were expected to embody Bushido asterisk, not just as a code of combat, but as a code of ethical governance. They were the stewards of order, the bridge between the divine authority of the emperor and the practical needs of the state. Just below the warriors were the peasants. In the Neo-Confucian logic, the peasant occupied a position of high moral dignity despite their grueling lives. They were the producers, the essential foundation upon which the entire nation rested. Because they produced the rice, the very currency of the era, they were viewed as the lifeblood of the economy. To the shogunate, a prosperous peasantry meant a stable state. Yet this dignity was a heavy one. Peasants were bound to their land, subject to strict taxation, and viewed as the silent, stoic pillars of a society that demanded their constant, uncomplaining labor. Then came the artisans. These were the craftsmen, the carpenters, the weavers, and the smiths. They were the makers of the world, transforming raw materials into the tools and luxuries that define Japanese life. While they possessed specialized skills that were vital to the culture, they were ranked below the peasants because they did not produce the fundamental sustenance of life. They were essential, yes, but they were secondary to the earth itself. Finally, at the very bottom of the social ladder were the merchants. In the traditional Neo-Confucian view, merchants were seen as social parasites. They did not produce anything. They merely moved goods from one hand to another, profiting from the labor of the classes above them. They were viewed with a deep, systemic suspicion, seen as people driven by greed rather than duty. By codifying these roles, the shogunate created a society where every individual was a single, unmoving piece in a vast, interlocking puzzle. It was a system designed to make rebellion unthinkable, for to challenge the hierarchy was not just a political crime. It was a violation of the natural order of the universe. 1633, Edo. But a rigid internal hierarchy is only half of the equation for total control. To truly freeze time and prevent the gears of chaos from turning again, the Tokugawa shogunate realized they had to look outward. They understood a terrifying truth. Ideas, like viruses, can be just as destabilizing as armies. And in the 17th century, the most potent ideas arriving on Japanese shores were not just goods, but ideologies. For decades, the Nanban, or Southern barbarians, the Portuguese and Spanish traders, had been making inroads. They brought silk, silver, and muskets, but they brought something far more subversive: Christianity. To the shogunate, the Christian faith was not merely a religious practice. It was a direct threat to the Neo-Confucian order. Christianity preached a loyalty to a divine God that superseded any loyalty to a temporal shogun. It introduced a concept of spiritual equality that threatened to dissolve the carefully constructed walls of the asterisk Shinikoso class system. If all men were equal in the eyes of God, how could the shogun claim absolute authority over the social hierarchy? The tension reached a breaking point. The shogunate viewed the spread of Christianity as a precursor to European colonization, a Trojan horse designed to weaken Japan from within before a full-scale invasion could occur. The response was swift, brutal, and absolute. Through a series of edicts issued in the 1630s, the shogunate enacted what would become known as *sakoku*, the locked country policy. Sakoku was not a total sealing of the borders, but a masterful orchestration of controlled contact. It was a strategic isolation designed to filter out the poison of foreign influence while retaining the medicine of foreign knowledge. The shogunate effectively nationalized all foreign relations. The Portuguese were expelled, and Christian missionaries were hunted and persecuted with terrifying efficiency. Travelers were forbidden from leaving, and Japanese citizens were strictly prohibited from returning to the mainland under pain of death. The world outside was to be treated as a realm of danger and instability. However, the shogunate was not blind to the benefits of global trade. They did not want to be a hermit kingdom, they wanted to be a curated one. They established a single, highly regulated gateway to the outside world, the man-made island of Dejima in the harbor of Nagasaki. Here, through a narrow window, the shogunate allowed the Dutch, who, unlike the Spanish, were interested in commerce rather than conversion, to trade. Dejima became a tiny, artificial outpost of the West, a controlled laboratory where the shogunate could observe foreign technology, medicine, and science without allowing the contagion of foreign politics or religion to seep into the mainland. This trickle of information, known as *rangaku or Dutch learning, would eventually become a vital lifeline for the nation. But for the next 2 centuries, the gates remained largely shut. By implementing *sakoku*, the Tokugawa shogunate achieved the impossible. They severed the unpredictable connections of the global maritime Silk Road and replaced them with a closed circuit. They created a vacuum in which Japanese culture could breathe, evolve, and flourish, undisturbed by the turbulent shifts of the outside world. The nation was now a fortress, a sanctuary of stability, protected by the silence of the sea. 1635, Edo. With the borders of Japan effectively sealed and the external threats neutralized by the policy of *sakoku*, the Tokugawa shogunate turned its gaze inward. The challenge was no longer how to keep the world out, but how to keep the powerful men within the borders in check. The shogunate ruled through a delicate, high-stakes balancing act. At the heart of this system were the daimyo, the territorial lords who governed the various domains across the archipelago. While they were technically vassals to the shogun, their power was immense. They possessed their own armies, their own tax bases, and their own ancestral legacies. In the previous century, these lords had been the architects of chaos, tearing the nation apart in the fires of the Sengoku period. To the Tokugawa, a daimyo was a sleeping dragon, a necessary part of the political landscape, but one that could wake and incinerate the peace at any moment. To prevent this, the shogunate implemented a masterstroke of political engineering, the Sankinkadai * system, or alternate attendance. The logic was deceptively simple, yet devastatingly effective. Under this mandate, every daimyo was required to spend every other year living in the capital of Edo, under the direct and watchful eye of the shogun. When a lord returned to his home domain to manage his lands, he was required to leave his wife and his heir behind in Edo, effectively serving as high-status hostages. On the surface, Sankinkadai was presented as a gesture of respect and a way to ensure the stability of the shogunate. In reality, it was a sophisticated mechanism of financial and political strangulation. The logistical burden of the system was astronomical. A daimyo could not simply travel alone. He was required to move with a massive, glittering procession of samurai, attendants, and servants. These processions often stretched for miles, a mobile display of status and wealth. The journey from a distant domain like Satsuma or Choshu to Edo could take weeks, if not months, traversing treacherous mountain passes and winding coastal roads. The cost of these journeys, combined with the necessity of maintaining two lavish residences, one in their home province and one in the capital, was ruinous. The shogunate essentially forced the daimyo to bleed their treasuries dry. A lord who was constantly spending his gold on silk, servants, and the upkeep of grand mansions in Edo was a lord who could not afford to fund a rebellion. He could not buy new cannons. He could not recruit an army of thousands. He could not stockpile the grain needed for a long siege. But the genius of *Sankinkadai went beyond mere economics. It served as a massive, forced exchange of culture and intelligence. As the lords moved through the country, they created a constant flow of information and goods. The roads became arteries of commerce, linking the isolated provinces to the heart of the nation. The system unintentionally fueled the growth of a national economy and the rise of a sophisticated urban culture. By turning the daimyo from independent warlords into extravagant traveling courtiers, the Tokugawa shogunate achieved a peace that had eluded Japan for centuries. They did not break the power of the lords through total conquest. They broke it through the weight of their own prestige. The dragon was not slain. It was simply kept too busy and too broke to ever breathe fire again. 1650, Edo. While the Sankinkadai system was designed to drain the wealth of the warrior class, it inadvertently acted as a massive, unintended engine for a new kind of power. The very roads that carried the daimyo's glittering processions were also carrying something far more transformative, the lifeblood of commerce. As the daimyo and their massive entourages descended upon Edo, the city began to swell. What was once a marshy fishing village was rapidly being transformed into one of the largest urban centers in the world. By the mid-17th century, Edo was no longer just a political fortress. It was becoming a sprawling, breathing metropolis. This was not a growth driven by conquest or expansion, but by a silent, steady accumulation of people and purpose. The demand created by the daimyo's presence was insatiable. Thousands of samurai, attendants, and servants required food, clothing, housing, and entertainment. This created a vacuum that only one group could fill, the Chonin asterisk or the townspeople. In the rigid Neo-Confucian hierarchy established by the Tokugawa, the social order was clear and unyielding. At the top were the samurai, the moral and political leaders. Below them were the peasants, the backbone of the economy who produced the rice. Then came the artisans, the makers of tools and art. And at the very bottom, the lowest rung of the social ladder, were the merchants. In the eyes of the state, merchants were considered parasites. They produced nothing of value, merely moving goods from one hand to another and profiting from the labor of others. But while the merchants held the lowest social status, they were quietly seizing control of the nation's actual wealth. As the daimyo spent their rice and gold to maintain their status in Edo, they became increasingly dependent on a complex system of credit and exchange. They could not eat gold, and they could not wear silk in the fields. They needed the merchants to convert their massive harvests of rice into the liquid capital required to fund their extravagant lifestyles. A new, sophisticated urban economy began to pulse through the streets of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto. The merchants became the masters of logistics, managing the flow of rice from the countryside to the cities, and the distribution of luxury goods from the coastal ports to the interior. They established warehouses, developed complex banking systems, and pioneered insurance and credit networks that far outpaced the primitive financial structures of the warrior class. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore. The samurai, who possessed the status and the swords, were becoming increasingly indebted to the very people they looked down upon. The parasites were, in fact, the ones holding the purse strings of the nation. This shift triggered a fundamental transformation in the Japanese landscape. The countryside was no longer a collection of isolated fiefdoms, but a cog in a vast, interconnected commercial machine. Urbanization was no longer just about population density. It was about the concentration of capital. As the cities grew, they became more than just administrative hubs. They became crucibles of a new, vibrant, and decidedly non-samurai culture. The silent growth of the merchant class was quietly eroding the foundations of the feudal order, setting the stage for a world where wealth would eventually prove more powerful than the blade. 1700, Edo. As the merchant class consolidated its wealth, a profound psychological shift began to take hold within the urban centers. For centuries, the Japanese worldview had been dominated by Buddhist notions of *ukiyo*, a term that originally carried a somber, even mournful connotation. In the old sense, the floating world referred to the transience of life, the painful reality that all things are ephemeral, and that human existence is a series of fleeting, sorrowful attachments in a world of suffering. But as the gold flowed through the hands of the *chonin*, the meaning of the word underwent a radical, subversive transformation. The merchants and artisans of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto were not interested in the asceticism of the monk or the stoic discipline of the samurai. They lived in a world of constant motion, of rapid commerce, and of sensory overload. To them, if life was indeed fleeting and ephemeral, then the only logical response was not to mourn its passing, but to celebrate it. They reimagined the floating world not as a place of sorrow, but as a place of hedonistic escape. If life was a dream that would soon end, they decided, they might as well enjoy the most beautiful parts of it while they lasted. This was the birth of *ukiyo*, the floating world of pleasure. It was a culture defined by its boundaries. It existed in the pleasure districts, such as the Yashiwara in Edo, where the rigid social hierarchies of the Tokugawa shogunate seemed to dissolve behind high walls and paper screens. Within these districts, the strict Neo-Confucian rules of rank and station were replaced by a new currency: taste, wit, and wealth. Here, a common merchant could command the attention of a celebrated courtesan, and a low-ranking samurai might find himself lost in the intoxicating atmosphere of a tea house. The floating world became a sanctuary for the senses. It was a realm of exquisite aesthetics, where every detail was curated to provide an escape from the crushing weight of social obligation. This culture birthed an explosion of artistic expression that would define the visual identity of Japan for centuries to come. The most iconic of these was ukiyo-e *, pictures of the floating world. Through the medium of woodblock printing, the ephemeral beauty of the districts was captured and mass-produced. These prints did not depict the grand battles of the Sengoku period or the solemnity of religious icons. Instead, they focused on the now. They captured the dramatic pose of a kabuki actor, the graceful silhouette of a beautiful woman, the sweeping landscapes of the Takeido Road, and the fleeting pleasures of a summer festival. These prints were the pop culture of their era. They were affordable, colorful, and highly sought after, spreading the imagery of the pleasure districts to every corner of the urban landscape. They were a celebration of the transient moment, the curve of a neck, the falling of a cherry blossom, the sudden movement of a performer on stage. In the floating world, the pursuit of pleasure was not merely a pastime. It was a quiet rebellion. By investing their wealth in art, fashion, and entertainment, the merchant class was building a cultural empire that the shogunate could control with laws, but could never truly conquer with swords. The sword belonged to the warrior, but the soul of the era was being captured by the brush. 1700, Edo. If the ukiyo-e prints were the snapshots of this era, then the theater was its heartbeat. As the merchant class poured its newfound wealth into the pursuit of beauty, the streets of Edo and Osaka began to pulse with a new kind of energy, one that was loud, colorful, and unapologetically dramatic. This was the era when storytelling moved from the quiet temples and private courts into the roaring, crowded theaters of the urban masses. At the center of this whirlwind stood kabuki. Born from the subversive dances of women and young boys, kabuki had evolved by the early 18th century into a highly stylized, spectacular art form. It was the ultimate sensory assault. To step into a kabuki theater was to leave the gray, disciplined world of the Tokugawa social order and enter a realm of hyperreality. Everything was exaggerated. The makeup, known as Kumadori used bold lines of red and blue to trace the very veins of emotion on an actor's face. The movements were not natural, but a series of rhythmic, powerful poses known as designed to freeze a moment of peak intensity. Kabuki was the pop culture of the Edo period. Its actors were the superstars of the floating world, their fashions imitated by women in the streets, and their likenesses sold on woodblock prints. The plays themselves mirrored the duality of the age. On one hand, there were Jidemono grand historical epics that dealt with the legends of the samurai and the tragedies of the past. On the other, there were Suamano domestic dramas that focused on the lives of commoners. These latter plays were particularly potent. They explored the agonizing conflict between Jiri social obligation, and Ninjo human emotion. They told stories of star-crossed lovers, merchants driven to ruin, and the impossible choices forced upon individuals by a rigid society. But while kabuki dazzled with visual spectacle, another art form was mastering the nuances of the human soul, bunraku. In the puppet theaters of Osaka, a different kind of magic was unfolding. Bunraku was not merely puppetry. It was a sophisticated, high-art form of storytelling that demanded absolute precision. Here, three puppeteers worked in perfect, unspoken synchronicity to breathe life into a single character. One controlled the head and right hand, another the left, and a third the feet. They moved with such grace that the boundary between wood and flesh seemed to dissolve. In Bunraku, the storyteller, the Gidyu narrator, was the soul of the performance. Accompanied by the percussive, rhythmic strike of the shamisen the narrator did not just speak the lines. They channeled the internal monologues, the weeping, the rage, and the desperate prayers of the characters. While kabuki offered the thrill of the visual, bunraku offered the depth of the auditory and the emotional. It was a medium capable of exploring the most profound tragedies of the human condition, with a haunting, stylized elegance. Together, kabuki and bunraku formed the dual pillars of Edo entertainment. They were the mirrors held up to a society in transition. In the roar of the kabuki stage and the rhythmic lament of the bunraku puppet, the people of Japan found a way to process their world. They saw their struggles, their passions, and their fleeting joys played out in the light of the theater, proving that while the shogun might rule the land, the stories of the people belonged to them alone. 1750, Edo. If the roaring theaters of kabuki and the haunting puppets of bunraku represented the loud, public heartbeat of the floating world, then a different kind of revolution was unfolding in the quiet spaces between the breaths of the city. As the urban masses grew more literate and more reflective, the cultural energy of Japan began to turn inward. The spectacle was retreating from the stage, and the profound was moving into the palm of the hand. This was the dawn of the literary Renaissance, a period where the complex, aristocratic poetry of the past was being distilled into its purest, most potent form, haiku. For centuries, Japanese poetry had been the domain of the elite, characterized by long, winding verses and the heavy weight of classical allusion. But the Edo period demanded something different. The rising merchant class and the increasingly educated commoners sought a language that was immediate, accessible, and deeply connected to the fleeting reality of their own lives. They didn't want to read about ancient legends. They wanted to capture the dewdrop on a leaf, the sudden chill of an autumn wind, or the transient beauty of a cherry blossom falling in a crowded street. At the heart of this transformation was the evolution of *heikai*, a playful, collaborative form of verse, which eventually crystallized into the 17-syllable masterpiece we now recognize as haiku. This was not poetry of grand declarations. It was poetry of the moment. It was an art of subtraction. By stripping away the ornamental, the poet was forced to find the infinite within the infinitesimal. The master of this distilled reality was Matsuo Basho. Though his work began in the late 17th century, his influence acted as the tidal wave that shaped the literary landscape of the mid-18th century. Basho transformed haiku from a mere word game into a spiritual discipline. To him, poetry was not just about cleverness. It was about Fuki Ryuko *, the intersection of the eternal and the ephemeral. A great poem, in Basho's view, could capture a single, passing moment while simultaneously touching upon the timeless truths of the universe. Through his travels across the Japanese countryside, Basho turned the act of walking into an act of writing. His journeys became legendary, proving that the poet was not a hermit in a mountain hut, but a wanderer engaging with the living, breathing world. His influence sparked a literary fever that swept through the social strata. In the tea houses of Edo and the scholar dens of Kyoto, people of all backgrounds began to practice this art. It became a social bridge. A merchant could sit beside a low-ranking samurai, and through the shared rhythm of 17 syllables, they could find a common humanity. This literary renaissance was more than just a change in style. It was a shift in consciousness. It reflected a society that was becoming increasingly introspective. In a world governed by the rigid, unyielding laws of the Tokugawa shogunate, the haiku offered a private sanctuary of freedom. Within the tiny confines of a poem, an individual could find a space that no law could reach, a space of pure perception. As the Edo period reached its cultural zenith, this mastery of the brief and the beautiful became a defining characteristic of the Japanese soul. The literature of the age proved that greatness did not require volume, and that the most profound truths are often whispered, not shouted. In the silence following a single line of verse, the people of Japan found a reflection of their own transient, beautiful, and deeply complex existence. 1750, Edo. But while the poets were finding transcendence in the silence of a 17-syllable verse, a much louder, more chaotic tension was vibrating through the streets of Japan's burgeoning metropolises. If the haiku was the soul of the era, the economy was its relentless, driving pulse. And that pulse was beating in a way that threatened to shatter the very foundations of the Tokugawa social order. For centuries, the Neo-Confucian hierarchy had been the bedrock of Japanese stability. It was a rigid vertical ladder. The samurai sat at the apex, followed by the peasants who produced the food, the artisans who crafted the tools, and at the very bottom, the merchants, the Chonin asterisk, viewed as parasites who produced nothing, merely moving wealth from one hand to another. In the eyes of the shogunate, the merchant was a social bottom feeder, a man of no honor, driven only by the base instinct of profit. Yet as the great peace of the Edo period deepened, a profound irony began to take hold. The long era of stability had stifled the need for war, and without war, the samurai, the warrior caste, had lost their primary function. They were no longer battlefield commanders. They were bureaucrats, administrators, and scholars. They were paid in fixed stipends of rice, a commodity whose value fluctuated wildly with the seasons and the harvest. Meanwhile, the merchants, long relegated to the fringes of respectability, were quietly seizing the reins of the nation's vitality. The peace had allowed for unprecedented urbanization and trade. Cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto had become massive engines of consumption. The merchants, through savvy credit systems, sophisticated banking, and the control of luxury goods, began to amass mountains of gold. A quiet, invisible revolution was underway. The flow of power was moving upward, not through lineage or martial prowess, but through the ledger and the coin. The result was a social dissonance that felt increasingly absurd. In the tea houses and high-end boutiques of the pleasure districts, the asterisk Chonin lived lives of unimaginable splendor. They were the patrons of the arts, the architects of the floating world, and the masters of fashion. They possessed the liquid wealth to buy anything their hearts desired. Conversely, many samurai were falling into a slow, dignified decay. To maintain the appearance of their high status, they were forced to adhere to expensive social rituals and dress codes that their dwindling rice stipends could no longer support. They became trapped in a cycle of debt, forced to borrow from the very merchants they were socially mandated to despise. The man who held the sword was often a pauper, while the man who held the coin was a king in all but name. This was the great paradox of late Edo Japan. The social structure told a story of honor and hierarchy, but the economic reality told a story of capital and class. The samurai clung to the fading prestige of their ancestry, while the merchants built a new world of commerce and culture. This friction, the tension between the prestige of the blade and the power of the purse, became the slow-burning fuse that would eventually contribute to the destabilization of the entire Tokugawa system, setting the stage for a world that could no longer be held together by tradition alone. 1780, Edo. As the economic foundations of the Tokugawa shogunate began to crack under the weight of this merchant-driven prosperity, a parallel revolution was taking place within the minds of the Japanese intelligentsia. The tension was no longer just about who held the coin or the sword. It was about who held the truth. For generations, the intellectual landscape of Japan had been dominated by Neo-Confucianism, a Chinese import that emphasized social order, hierarchy, and the heavy-handed moralism of the mainland. But as the Edo period matured, a profound restlessness began to stir. Intellectuals began to look inward, seeking a way to define what it truly meant to be Japanese, and they looked outward, seeking to understand the mysterious world that lay beyond their closed borders. This duality of thought manifested in two powerful, seemingly contradictory movements, Kokugaku and Rangaku. First, there was Kokugaku, or national learning. It was a movement born of cultural longing and a desire for spiritual purity. Scholars like Matori Norinaga began to argue that the heavy influence of Chinese thought, both Confucianism and Buddhism, had acted as a layer of dust, obscuring the true, radiant essence of the Japanese spirit. They turned their eyes away from the mainland and toward the ancient past. They delved into the Manyoshu asterisk, the oldest collection of Japanese poetry, and the Kojiki asterisk, the nation's foundational myths. Through the study of classical Japanese literature and the ancient language, the Kokugaku scholars sought to strip away the foreign impurities and rediscover the concept of mono no aware asterisk, the poignant, bittersweet awareness of the transience of things. This wasn't just a literary pursuit, it was a political awakening. By emphasizing the divine lineage of the emperor and the unique, unshakable identity of the Japanese people, Kokugaku provided the ideological tools that would eventually be used to challenge the legitimacy of the shogunate itself. It suggested that the true heart of Japan resided not in the military administration of the Tokugawa, but in the ancient, sacred authority of the imperial throne. Yet, while Kokugaku was looking backward to the purity of the past, another group of scholars was looking forward through a narrow window in the north. This was Rangaku, or Dutch learning. Despite the policy of Sakoku or national isolation, the shogunate maintained a singular, controlled umbilical cord to the outside world, the Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki. Through this tiny artificial island, a trickle of Western knowledge began to seep into the Japanese consciousness. This was not the religion of the Nanban foreigners, which the shogunate had long suppressed, but something far more practical and perhaps more dangerous: science. Japanese scholars began to master the Dutch language, not to trade spices, but to trade ideas. They studied anatomy, botany, astronomy, and medicine. They peered through telescopes and dissected cadavers, realizing that the Western understanding of the physical world was often more precise than the traditional models taught in the Confucian academies. Rangaku offered a window into a world of empirical evidence and mechanical progress, a world that operated on laws of nature rather than the dictates of social hierarchy. Thus, the intellectual landscape of late Edo Japan became a battlefield of perspectives. On one side, Kokugaku sought to fortify the national soul through tradition and antiquity. On the other, Rangaku sought to modernize the national mind through science and observation. Together, these two currents created a powerful intellectual friction. They were the two forces that would eventually tear the veil of isolation, preparing the Japanese mind for the inevitable collision with the modern world. 1782, Tenmei. But while scholars debated the nature of the soul and the mechanics of the stars, a much more visceral and brutal reality was tearing at the very fabric of the nation. If the intellectual shifts of Kokugaku and Rangaku were a slow-burning fuse, the economic and environmental catastrophes of the late 18th century were the explosion that followed. The Great Peace of the Tokugawa era, once celebrated as a triumph of stability, was beginning to reveal its most hollow truth. The system was starving. The illusion of prosperity was shattered by a series of devastating natural disasters. The Tenmei famine, one of the most catastrophic in Japanese history, descended upon the archipelago with a merciless vengeance. Successive years of volcanic eruptions, most notably the eruption of Mount Asama, choked the skies with ash, disrupting the climate and plunging temperatures. The rains failed, the crops withered, and the rice, the very lifeblood of the Japanese economy and the basis of the tax system, vanished from the fields. In the rural provinces, the situation was nothing short of apocalyptic. As the rice harvests failed, the price of food skyrocketed beyond the reach of the commoner. Families were reduced to eating bark, grass, and even sawdust to survive. Disease followed the hunger, sweeping through depopulated villages like a scythe. This was not merely a seasonal hardship, it was a systemic collapse. The shogunate's rigid structure, designed for a world of steady agricultural output, proved utterly incapable of managing a crisis of this magnitude. The bureaucracy was paralyzed by its own hierarchy, and the wealth of the merchant class, while growing, could not be easily redistributed to the dying peasantry. The resentment born of this misery did not stay silent. It manifested in the Hayakusho Ikki asterisk, violent, desperate peasant uprisings. These were not organized political revolutions in the modern sense, but they were profound expressions of rage against a system that demanded taxes in rice while providing no protection against starvation. From the northern reaches of Tohoku to the heartlands of central Japan, villages rose up. They marched on granaries, they burned the records of tax collectors, and they confronted the local daimyo, demanding nothing more than the right to exist. These uprisings signaled a terrifying breakdown of the Neo-Confucian social contract. The hierarchy dictated that the samurai protected the peasantry, and in exchange, the peasantry sustained the samurai. But as the peasants looked at their starving children and then at the well-fed officials in their fortified castles, that contract was revealed to be a lie. The social order was no longer a pillar of stability. It had become a cage. Simultaneously, the economic rot was deepening within the cities. The rise of the Chonin asterisk, the merchant class, had created a paradox that the Tokugawa could not resolve. The samurai, though technically at the top of the social hierarchy, were increasingly drowning in debt. They lived on fixed stipends of rice, but the economy had shifted toward a cash-based system controlled by the very merchants they were supposed to look down upon. The warrior class was becoming impoverished, while the lowly merchants were becoming the true masters of Japan's wealth. The internal rot was complete. The spiritual, the intellectual, and the material foundations of the shogunate were all fracturing at once. The great machine of the Tokugawa era was no longer a symbol of order. It was a decaying structure, waiting for a single, external blow to bring it crashing down. July 1853, Uraga Harbor. For over 200 years, the shores of Japan had been a sanctuary of silence. The Sakoku policy, the policy of national isolation, had acted as a massive, invisible wall, shielding the archipelago from the turbulence of the outside world. To the Tokugawa shogunate, this isolation was the ultimate guarantor of peace. To the Japanese people, the world beyond the horizon was a distant, mythic abstraction. But that silence was about to be shattered by the thunder of steam engines and the roar of heavy artillery. On a morning that would forever alter the course of human history, the horizon of Uraga Harbor began to darken. It was not the familiar, low-slung silhouette of a coastal junk or a Chinese trading vessel. Instead, emerging from the mist were four colossal, black-hulled monsters. These were the black ships of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. To the Japanese observers on the shore, these vessels were unlike anything they had ever seen. They were made of iron and dark wood, belching thick, black plumes of coal smoke into the pristine sky. They did not rely on the fickle whims of the wind. They moved with a terrifying, mechanical purpose, propelled by paddle wheels that churned the sea into a frenzy. These were not merely ships. They were floating fortresses, symbols of an industrial might that Japan could scarcely comprehend. As the ships dropped anchor, the shogunate's response was one of frantic, paralyzed indecision. The officials in Edo were caught in a nightmare of conflicting duties. To fire upon the Americans would be an act of war against a technologically superior power, a gamble that could lead to the total destruction of the nation. To do nothing, however, would be to admit that the shogunate's absolute authority over its own waters had evaporated. Commodore Perry did not come to trade in the traditional sense. He came to demand. He brought with him a letter from President Millard Fillmore, demanding that Japan open its ports to American vessels to protect shipwrecked sailors and to establish diplomatic relations. He backed these words with a terrifying demonstration of force. The black ships were armed with massive cannons, and the sheer scale of their firepower served as a silent, looming threat. Open your doors, or we shall force them. The arrival of the black ships acted as a lightning bolt striking a landscape already primed for destruction. The internal rot described by the scholars and the starving peasants was suddenly met by an external, overwhelming pressure. The Great Peace had not just been interrupted, it had been exposed as a fragile illusion. The shogunate found itself in an impossible position. They were forced to negotiate, eventually signing the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, effectively ending 2 centuries of isolation. But this concession came at a devastating political cost. To the traditionalists, the samurai, and the fiercely nationalistic Shishi asterisk, the shogunate's capitulation was nothing short of treason. The iron rule of the Tokugawa had been broken by smoke and steam. The black ships had done more than just bring foreign diplomats to Japanese shores. They had brought the realization that the old world was dying. The wall of asterisk Sakoku had fallen, and through the breach, the modern world was rushing in, bringing with it the tools of progress, the threat of colonization, and the inevitable end of the samurai era. 1854. Edo and the domains of Satsuma and Choshu. The signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa was not a moment of peace, but a catalyst for chaos. As the ink dried on the documents that ended Japan's isolation, a profound sense of humiliation rippled through the warrior class. To many, the Tokugawa shogunate had not merely negotiated with a foreign power, they had surrendered the very soul of Japan. The shogun, once the invincible protector of the realm, now appeared as a trembling subordinate to Western giants. From this atmosphere of betrayal and existential dread, a new and volatile force began to coalesce. They were known as the Shishi asterisk, the men of high purpose. The Shishi were not a formal army, nor were they a unified political party. They were a decentralized, feverish movement of radical samurai, intellectuals, and low-ranking warriors who believed that the only way to save Japan was to destroy the system that had failed it. They were driven by a potent and ancient slogan that would become the heartbeat of their rebellion, Sano Joy asterisk. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. For centuries, the emperor had been a divine but powerless figurehead, a spiritual sun around which the political world orbited but never touched. The Shishi sought to flip this hierarchy on its head. They argued that the shogunate's legitimacy was derived from the emperor, and by failing to defend the nation from the black ships, the shogunate had forfeited its right to rule. They envisioned a Japan where the emperor's authority was restored to the center of government, purging the barbarian influence that the Tokugawa had allowed to seep through the cracks of the broken isolation. The Shishi were men of intense, often suicidal, conviction. They were the personification of the Bushido spirit taken to a radical extreme. They did not seek political debate, they sought action. In the streets of Kyoto and the bustling districts of Edo, the Shishi engaged in a campaign of political assassination and targeted violence. They struck at shogunate officials, targeting those they deemed collaborators with the West. They were shadows in the night, moving through the narrow alleys of the capital, their blades fueled by a righteous, burning fury. But the Shishi were more than just assassins. They were the vanguard of a massive intellectual shift. They were fueled by Kokugaku asterisk, or national learning, a movement that sought to rediscover Japan's pure, ancient identity, stripped of foreign, especially Confucian and Buddhist, influence. They looked backward to a mythic, glorious past to find the strength to face a terrifying, industrial future. However, the Shishi were also a fractured group. While they all shared a hatred for the shogunate, they were divided by strategy. Some believed in purely xenophobic isolationism, dreaming of a Japan where every foreign ship was sunk and every Westerner driven into the sea. Others, more pragmatic and dangerous, realized that to expel the barbarians, Japan first had to learn from them. They saw that the black ships were not just threats, but mirrors, reflecting Japan's own technological inadequacy. As the 1850s progressed, the tension between these factions and the crumbling shogunate reached a breaking point. The Shishi had ignited a fire that no amount of political maneuvering could extinguish. The era of the Great Peace was dead, and in its place, a storm of blood and steel was gathering. The Shishi were no longer just a group of radicals. They were the heralds of a revolution that would tear the fabric of feudal Japan apart. 1868, Kyoto and the outskirts of Edo. The tension that had been simmering in the streets of Kyoto for years finally boiled over into a conflagration that would consume the old world. The era of political assassinations and radical slogans had transitioned into something far more absolute: civil war. This was the Boshin War, the final, violent collision between the dying embers of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rising sun of the imperial restoration. The spark was the Battle of Toba-Fushimi. In the early months of 1868, the forces of the shogunate, numbering in the tens of thousands, met the combined armies of the pro-imperial domains of Satsuma and Choshu. On paper, the shogunate held the advantage in numbers and traditional military prestige. But the battlefield revealed a terrifying truth. The age of the sword was being superseded by the age of the gun. The Satsuma and Choshu forces, though smaller, were equipped with modern Western rifles and artillery. They fought not with the ritualized grace of ancient samurai warfare, but with the disciplined, devastating efficiency of modern infantry. As the shogunate's forces retreated toward Edo, the war became a desperate race for the heart of Japan. The conflict was no longer just a struggle for political dominance. It was a struggle for the very identity of the nation. The shogunate fought to preserve a centuries-old social order, a world of rigid castes and feudal loyalties. The imperial faction fought for a centralized state, a unified Japan capable of standing equal to the Western powers. The war reached its psychological climax during the siege of Edo. As the imperial armies closed in on the great capital, the world held its breath, expecting a bloodbath that would level the city. But in a moment of profound political maneuvering, Seigo Takamori, one of the great leaders of the Satsuma domain, negotiated a bloodless surrender with the shogun's representative, Katsukaishu. The city was spared, but the shogunate was effectively dead. The Tokugawa era, which had provided 2.5 centuries of stability, had vanished in a single stroke of diplomacy and military pressure. Yet the war was not over. A faction of die-hard shogunate loyalists, refusing to accept the new reality, fled north to Hokkaido, establishing a short-lived republic known as the Republic of Ezo. This final, desperate stand served as a grim epilogue to the conflict. It was a war of shadows and iron, where samurai fought alongside peasants armed with Snider rifles, and where the traditional values of Bushido were tested against the cold, industrial logic of modern warfare. When the final resistance was crushed, the landscape of Japan had been irrevocably altered. The Boshin War was more than just a change in government. It was the funeral procession for the samurai class itself. The warriors who had defined Japan for nearly a millennium had won their revolution, but in doing so, they had rendered their own way of life obsolete. The swords that had once been the symbols of soul and status were being replaced by the bayonets of a modern conscript army. The Boshin War had cleared the path for the Meiji era, leaving behind a nation that was no longer a collection of feudal domains, but a single, burgeoning empire, standing on the precipice of a new and uncertain modernity. 1868, Kyoto and the outskirts of Edo. The smoke from the Battle of Toba-Fushimi had barely cleared when the realization set in. The Tokugawa shogunate was no longer a governing body, it was a relic. For over 250 years, the shogun had been the sun around which the Japanese political universe orbited. But that sun was setting, eclipsed by the rising tide of the San Joy movement. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. While the slogan had begun as a xenophobic outcry against the black ships, it had evolved into something far more profound. It had become a political weapon used by the ambitious southern domains of Satsuma and Choshu to strip the shogunate of its legitimacy. They argued that the shogun was not a ruler, but a mere usurper of the emperor's divine authority. By framing their rebellion as a restoration of the rightful sovereign, they transformed a civil coup into a holy crusade for the soul of Japan. In the halls of the imperial palace in Kyoto, the transition of power began to take a tangible, legal shape. The young Emperor Meiji, once a ceremonial figurehead hidden behind silk screens and ancient ritual, was being brought into the light of the political arena. He was no longer just a symbol of tradition. He was to become the centerpiece of a centralized, modern state. The decree for the restoration of imperial rule was issued, effectively declaring the shogunate's administration null and void. This was the death knell for the old order. The fall of the shogunate was not merely the loss of a single office, but the total collapse of the *Bakufu* system, the intricate web of land, loyalty, and vassalage that had held the feudal domains together. As the shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, eventually retreated into political retirement, the structural pillars of the Edo period began to crumble. The daimyo, the great territorial lords, found themselves facing a terrifying choice: cling to their ancestral lands and face annihilation, or surrender their autonomy to the new imperial government. The restoration was not a return to the ancient ways of the Heian court, however. It was a radical, paradoxical revolution. To restore, The emperor was, in reality, to invent a new kind of government. The leaders of the Restoration, men like Seigo Takamori and Okubo Toshimichi, were not traditionalists. They were visionaries who understood that for Japan to survive the predatory gaze of Western imperialism, it had to abandon the very feudalism that had defined it. As the shogunate's administration dissolved, the vacuum was filled by a feverish, desperate energy. The concept of the nation began to supersede the concept of the domain. The old borders were being redrawn, not by the swords of the samurai, but by the pens of bureaucrats and the cannons of modern artillery. The Restoration had successfully reclaimed the emperor, but in doing so, it had unleashed a force that would forever change the Japanese identity. The era of the warrior was ending, and the era of the citizen was being born in the fires of a revolution that had no intention of looking back. 1871. Tokyo and the corridors of the new imperial government. The collapse of the shogunate had shattered the ceiling of Japanese society, but the foundations, the rigid four-tiered caste system that had dictated every aspect of life for centuries, remained standing. For generations, the social order had been an immovable architecture. The emperor at the apex, followed by the samurai, the peasants, the artisans, and finally, the merchants. At the heart of this structure was the samurai. They were not merely soldiers. They were the moral and administrative backbone of the nation, the only class permitted to carry the two swords that signaled their soul and their status. But the new Meiji government viewed this very structure as a fatal weakness. To the architects of modern Japan, the samurai were a luxury a developing nation could no longer afford. A centralized state required a unified national army, not a collection of private retinues loyal to individual lords. It required a standardized tax system, not the complex web of feudal stipends. Most importantly, it required a sense of national identity that transcended the local loyalties of the Han asterisk, or domains. To build a modern Japan, the government realized they had to kill the samurai. The dismantling began with the Heian Chiken asterisk, the abolition of the feudal domains. In a series of sweeping decrees, the great daimyo were stripped of their ancestral lands and replaced by government-appointed governors. Suddenly, the samurai were no longer the lords of their territories. They were men without a country. Then came the economic death blow, the abolition of stipends. For centuries, the samurai class had been supported by hereditary rice payments. The Meiji government, facing a mountain of debt and the crushing cost of modernization, converted these lifelong stipends into one-time government bonds. For many, these bonds were a hollow promise, a fraction of the wealth they had once commanded. The elite warrior class was being systematically impoverished, transformed overnight from a privileged aristocracy into a struggling middle class of bureaucrats, policemen, and teachers. The final, most symbolic blow was the Heitorei Edict of 1876. This decree forbade the carrying of swords in public. To a samurai, the asterisk daisho asterisk, the pair of swords, was more than a weapon. It was their dignity, their history, and their very essence. To see a man walking the streets of Tokyo without his blades was to see a ghost of a vanished era. The visual language of power had been rewritten. The top knot, the asterisk chanmage, was replaced by Western hairstyles. The silk kimono was traded for the wool frock coat. This was not a peaceful transition. For many, this was a betrayal of the very restoration they had fought to achieve. Men like Seigo Takamori, once the hero of the revolution, found themselves at odds with a government that was stripping away the honor of the warrior class. The resentment simmered, eventually boiling over into the Satsuma Rebellion, the final, bloody gasp of the traditionalist warrior. When the smoke of those final uprisings cleared, the verdict was absolute. The samurai class, which had shaped the destiny of Japan for nearly a millennium, had ceased to exist as a legal entity. The age of the individual warrior was dead, replaced by the age of the conscripted soldier and the disciplined citizen. The sword had been surrendered to the pen, and the soul of the warrior was being forcibly reforged into the engine of a modern industrial empire. 1873, Tokyo and the bustling ports of Yokohama. As the dust of the Satsuma Rebellion settled, a profound and unsettling silence fell over the old way of life. The era of the sword had not just ended, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced by something entirely unrecognizable. The transition from a feudal patchwork of domains to a centralized, modern nation-state was no longer a political struggle. It had become a total metamorphosis of the Japanese soul. The new government, fueled by an urgent, almost frantic fear of Western colonization, realized that survival required more than just new laws. It required a new kind of human being. The old identity, rooted in local loyalty to a daimyo and the hereditary prestige of a warrior lineage, was being replaced by a singular, terrifyingly efficient concept: the citizen of the empire. This transformation was most visible in the rapid-fire industrialization that began to reshape the landscape. Where once there were rice paddies and quiet feudal villages, steam engines began to hiss and telegraph wires began to stitch the islands together. The concept of time itself changed. In the Edo period, life moved by the seasons and the sun. In the Meiji era, it moved by the clock, the factory whistle, and the rigid schedule of the schoolroom. Education became the new battlefield for the Japanese identity. The government established a compulsory national education system, designed to strip away regional dialects and local superstitions, replacing them with a unified language and a standardized history. In these classrooms, the children of former samurai and former peasants sat side by side. They were no longer taught the intricacies of feudal etiquette or the specific martial arts of their clans. They were taught mathematics, science, and most importantly, a new, fervent devotion to the emperor. The emperor was no longer a distant, cloistered figurehead of the old court. He was being recast as the divine father of a modern, industrial family. This was a psychological revolution. The Japanese people were being taught to view themselves not as subjects of a local lord, but as part of a massive, cohesive machine. The concept of *Bushido*, once the private code of a specialized elite, was being distilled, romanticized, and broadcast to the entire population. The virtues of discipline, loyalty, and self-sacrifice were no longer just for the warrior. They were now the required traits of the factory worker, the student, and the conscripted soldier. By the turn of the century, the metamorphosis was startlingly complete. Japan had bypassed the slow, centuries-long evolution experienced by many Western powers, opting instead for a violent, concentrated burst of modernization. It was a dual identity, a nation that wore the frock coat and the top hat of the West, yet remained fueled by an ancient, distilled essence of martial spirit. The Japan that emerged from the wreckage of feudalism was a paradox. It was a nation that had successfully defended its sovereignty by adopting the tools of its potential conquerors. It had traded the elegance of the floating world for the grit of the industrial engine. The samurai were gone, but their ghost had been repurposed, reforged into a collective national will that would soon carry Japan from the periphery of the world stage to the very center of global power. The age of the warrior had ended, but the age of the empire had just begun.